Okay, so Danny, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to be here on the podcast.
Johnny, thanks for having me. I love talking about anything to do with nutrition, so it's a pleasure.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it's a perfect guest to have on because you pretty much talk about nutrition pretty much daily, if not
Too much, some people would say.
maybe.
Shut up.
My family and friends say the same thing to me, so don't worry. We're in good hands. For any of my listeners who may not know who you are, could you just give us a brief intro into who you are, what you do, and why they should care?
Sure. My name is Danny Lennon. I have a company called Sigma Nutrition with the goal of putting out educational media content about nutritional and health sciences. Primarily what we're maybe most known for right now is doing that via the podcast Sigma Nutrition Radio, which has been running since the start of 2014, where I basically interview researchers and practitioners each week on various different nutritional and health science topics. We also have online coaching service and put out some other online materials as well. My own background would be a undergraduate degree in biology and physics, and after that I did a master's degree in nutritional sciences from UCC in Ireland. And yeah, over the past, I suppose, 5-6 years, it's been trying to put out better and better information around anything to do with nutrition and health from I suppose, an evidence-based perspective.
Cool, great, and yeah, fantastic. So it's great to have you on. As everyone knows who listens to me regularly, evidence-based is kind of like the coin term that I harp on about all the time because it's hard to cut through a lot of the noise these days with regards to nutrition, unfortunately, just because of all the differing opinions.
Right. Yeah, it's a difficult one for sure, and it, like you say, the signal to noise ratio is probably not exactly how we would like, and it's very easy to sell misleading messages if someone wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, trying to put some sort of countercurrent in place is where I think a lot of us are at, and hopefully it's doing something to kind of stem the tide of nonsense going the other way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you started your podcast back in 2014. And I think since then, so many people have jumped on that bandwagon. And hopefully more and more of the evidence-based practitioners will eventually cut through it. We hope. We hope.
That is the hope, yes.
So you mentioned your own coaching service. And of course, we talked briefly before we went on air about working with combat athletes in particular. So could you just give us a brief overview of who it is you work with and your sort of experience coaching athletes as well?
Yeah. So I kind of, myself, I trained in some MMA, but mainly some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for quite a few years. Then quite a few years back now, maybe 5 or 6, started working with some pretty high-level Muay Thai and MMA athletes. From there, kind of word spread and kind of grew up a more of a kind of client base specifically in those sports. And yeah, just started working with more many pro boxers as well as amateur boxers, same pro and amateur MMA. We've worked with Olympic level taekwondo athletes, judokas at a national, international level, sambo players, Brazilian jiu-jitsu grapplers. So kind of across the gamut of combat sports, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And over that time, trying to see what were the kind of main challenges and roadblocks. And you start to see some kind of commonalities and issues that are probably typically encountered by those athletes, or maybe misconceptions they have about how they should fuel, not only for training and recovery, but also then you have this whole cutting weight aspect and making weight for competition, which adds in another layer of complexity. And given the types of workloads and training schedules they have and the variation in types of sessions those can be, it becomes more of a challenge to plan nutritionally than it would be for, say, let's say we work with a powerlifter and they maybe do 4 to 5 sessions per week. The type of session is the same in terms of like energy demands typically, and it's much more easier to quantify workload. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think, as we discussed offline, combat sport athletes, similarly to CrossFitters, as you'll know, the sessions have such variation, and the workloads for, or at least those at a very high competitive level, tend to be so ginormous. Trying to fuel those appropriately whilst also knowing we need to take into account body composition as well, because that plays a role for performance in both sports. And then also with combat sports, you have this other layer of weight classes. So yeah, being worked with athletes in many of the, thankfully, with the top organizations with the MMA, Bellator, 1FC, BAMA, many of those, pro title fights in boxing and so on. So it's been pretty lucky, and they're a good group of athletes to work with. They're pretty easy to talk with, and are very invested in doing what they need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you're with a population of people that's kind of like, we need to make sure you don't get punched in the face too many times. So it becomes kind of paramount importance that they do what they need to get as fit as they can.
Right. Yeah.
You covered some great points, and we'll probably knock on all of them. Particularly I think where a good place to start would be that idea of varied training, as you said there, in terms of different time domains, different training sessions, that kind of thing. As we mentioned with CrossFit, we could do a session where we're doing, most of the people that are competitive will do weight training and conditioning like every day. Whereas if they're a general population CrossFit member, they would go in and their workout one day could be strength based only. It could be strength and small conditioning piece. It could just be long conditioning piece. And so how do you approach with your athletes, either habit strategies or tracking strategies when you're saying, okay, if it's this session, we need to be doing this. If it's this session, we need to be doing this.
Yeah, probably one of the best ways to view this from is actually a term that has came out of some of the groups doing research, both in Liverpool and Birmingham. And I suppose James Morton, who is a professor at Liverpool John Moores University, has probably been most well recognized as using this phrase, fuel for the work required. Mm-hmm. Which again has been in his and some of his colleagues' papers, and it's kind of been a team effort. There's a fantastic paper for anyone interested, written by the group where Sam Impey was the lead author on it, where they talk about this kind of idea of fuel for the work required, where it's both looking at periodization of energy and carbohydrate intakes in different athletes. Mm-hmm. And so you could go deep into the kind of physiological stuff there if we're talking from like a nutritionist or physiologist perspective. But for like the pragmatic thing is to think about, okay, what sessions does this athlete have across the week? What are the fuel demands or energy systems being used in those sessions? So again, what type of, do they need carbohydrate? Do they need glycogen stores for this type of session? Is this a session that has a high priority for performance, or is it just a recovery session? So thinking of the nature of the session, the goal of the session, what the kind of energy systems requirements are, and then across the week trying to fuel appropriately on a kind of meal to meal or session to session basis, rather than saying, well, I'm an athlete, so I eat super high carb every meal all day, every day, or going the other way and saying, well, I just eat low carb because I get certain benefits from doing so. Instead, we can kind of mix and match and maybe think about what are demands across the week. So this can be difficult to piece through. So the difficult thing, as I'm sure you'll know, if we take the example, let's say we have a CrossFitter that's doing multiple sessions across the week, trying to get any sort of accurate estimation of their calorie expenditure is going to be close to impossible in any way to be accurate. So what we're probably going to use more on a week-to-week basis is, well, based on what they're currently eating and their average intake, how does that correspond to their change in body composition and body weight, and also their ability to perform and subjective markers of recovery. So if we see that let's say that athlete is gaining weight from week to week, then we know they're probably going to be in a calorie surplus. And if they don't want to be gaining weight, we can bring that down, or vice versa. If an athlete is trying to maintain weight and we see that their weight is starting to drop, or their performance from session to session is decreasing, or they're reporting being really tired, then we can probably know maybe this athlete is under fueling. And so we can try and increase that energy availability. Then we can talk about kind of macronutrient breakdowns and those kind of meal to meal, session to session ideas. Main one in this context, again, would be carbohydrate. what sessions of the week do we want full carbohydrate availability? So this would be both carbohydrate stored as glycogen in the muscle and liver, but also exogenous carbohydrate we might have as in a pre-workout meal or during that training session.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the idea that it's not just because I'm doing a CrossFit session, I need tons of carbohydrate all the time. It depends on what is that type of training session. So maybe you come in and it's just some strength work. You don't probably need to be smashing tons of carbohydrate for that.
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's like a recovery day or just something you come in just to get some moving, again, your demands are going to be different from that, from a session you're really pushing the boat out on, or maybe it's a day you're doing 2 sessions in the one day, or yesterday was a really tough session. And now today is like going to be really demanding in terms of carbohydrate demand. So typically high intensity stuff we're talking about here, you're going to fuel those slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
So how we communicate that to the athlete is probably going to depend on where they're at. A simple model that the Fuel for the Work Required kind of paradigm paper talked about would be, you could use say like a traffic light system of green, amber, red for high, moderate, low intakes of carbohydrate, and you would kind of put that across the week based on types of sessions. So that's one way to view it. And then we can peel it back as basic as we need. So we could have someone eating relatively similar all the time, and then maybe just slightly changing portion size, let's say on certain training days or certain days before even a training session. And then on days where they don't need it as much, we change the portion size or manipulate the types of foods consumed in those meals. So we can do all of that. So I guess it depends on what end of that spectrum of from elite level competitor all the way down to recreational CrossFitter, where on that spectrum and how much attention to detail we need to make for each specific meal. But that's a kind of general outline of how we can start thinking through this. Basically, what is the type of session you're doing? What is the kind of energy demands of that session? What is your goal for that session? So is it recovery or is it just performance? And then when was your last session or your next session relative to this current one? Because that probably makes a big difference.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you covered some fantastic points there. A lot for people to take away. I've talked about Fuel for the Work Required as well, thanks to the podcast episode that you had James on as well. So I've directed people to it. I talked about it as well as a sort of like mini recap. And I think it's great there for people to consider, as you said there, their goal, not only of the session, but in general, and the standard of athlete they are. Because almost you could say if they were just a person doing CrossFit or fitness to get healthier, you could say, well, daily your intake could look kind of similar, as long as on average you were heading toward your goal, whatever that would be. Scoping back to this whole idea then of changing energy depending on the type of day and the type of session, how would you then work with an athlete who wanted to cut weight but needed still to maximize their performance as much as possible?
Sure. So this is quite a common one of that kind of fight camp period for combat sport athletes. So they may have, let's say, hypothetically 8 weeks leading into a fight. And during that time, they're going to be gradually dieting to bring their body fat down. So they have less of an acute weight cut at the end. And so they're in a dieting condition, which for performance is actually not what we want. It's going to impact performance. So kind of your question is, well, how do we mitigate those downsides we're going to get when an athlete is under eating on calories? So there's a couple of things we're going to do. First is that kind of periodization of energy across the week. And this is one that intuitively most people might do anyway, or it seems quite logical, of saying, well, on the days that I need to, or I have bigger training sessions or need to perform more, can I partition more calories to those days? And then maybe I'll account for that by cutting back on some calories on recovery or rest days slightly. And so that way you're still having the same average calorie intake over a week, but you're just pushing more of them into times that are going to influence your training. Similarly, I would be quite a big fan of, even on a given day where the athlete is going to train, depending on that time, how can we partition more or bias more of those calories to pre-session as opposed to like late in the day. So if an athlete trains at, let's say, they're going to do a session at 4 p.m. instead of saying, well, as long as my daily calories and macros are okay, it doesn't really matter. So I'm just not going to eat much early in the day. I'm going to then have a big meal in the evening after I finish training. Instead, I would try and say, well, can we bias more of those calories to earlier in the day? Let's say those couple of meals before you're going to go and train at 4. Maybe you have a meal at 1, you have a meal at 10 a.m. If we can get more calories in those, we're going to have a higher degree of fuel, quote unquote, for that session. And so you may get better training quality then by kind of biasing it in that manner. So we can bias it on relative to when this training session is on any given day.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can also bias it over the course of a week to when we're going to have those certain training sessions. So if an athlete trains, let's say in the evening, it's relatively simple in that we'll put more calories on those high training days and less calories on others. If they train early in the morning, then we want their big kind of refeed or higher calorie or higher carbohydrate day might actually start the previous day to that, because they're going to be waking up and we want them to have full, let's say, carbohydrate stores for that training session. Mm-hmm. So we can do things like that. You can also use supplementation of caffeine is going to be really useful. So we know caffeine reduces the rate of perceived exertion during a session. So it might feel a bit easier to get through that workload. It also has that ergogenic effect. Any of the other kind of typical performance supplementation we're probably going to be using anyway to try and mitigate performance or mitigate downsides in performance. And then we can talk about other kind of non-nutritional factors as well if you wish. But that in terms of periodizing intake, that would be the main way we would try and account for an athlete dieting or under eating on calories in general. How do we bias it on a daily and weekly basis, if that makes sense?
Yeah, perfect. We'll definitely go into lifestyle as well. But while we're focused on food intake primarily, just for the listeners as well. Well, actually, I'm quite interested in terms of macronutrient composition. We know that from a science basis, if we're looking to just lose body fat and that's the only thing we need to do, that right. The ratio of macronutrients doesn't really matter. We need to get calories in the right place. Protein is pretty important from a muscle sparing point of view. Right. And then other than that, our carbohydrates and fats can differ depending on our preference, which is great right. from a general population point of view. If we're looking at performance, and feel free to use MMA, CrossFit, whatever you would like to use here, how do we adjust our macronutrients? Do we literally just vary the carbohydrate amount and keep fat fairly constant, or would you look to have some lower fat or higher fat days as well, depending on the training adaptation or even the work required that day?
Sure. So again, we should probably put the caveat of depending what end of that spectrum that this specific person is at. So if we take someone who says, does CrossFit, but maybe let's say 3 days a week, and they do a CrossFit session, right? Then for that person, I would say they would probably even fall into the category that you just outlined of once their overall calories are generally in the ballpark of appropriate for their goal, they're getting enough protein day to day, and maybe we can talk about how that protein is distributed, again, just for muscle and satiety, then the exact amount of carbohydrate and fat probably isn't going to make any real difference for that person per se, because there's so much time between sessions that they're going to be restoring glycogen anyway. Mm-hmm. They're not doing enough of a training load to probably ever even deplete glycogen completely. And so it's just not going to be a limiting factor from them. The kind of, maybe you can make an exception of if they're on a ketogenic diet chronically over a long period of time, they might see a dip in some of their CrossFit sessions for sure. Mm-hmm. But if it's not that case and there's any kind of even moderate or low to moderate amount of carbohydrate in the diet, and they're not actively super restrictive on fat that goes too low, then the exact amount of those I don't think really matters. Where it probably matters more is as we get into athletes doing high demanding sessions daily, or even those that are doing multiple sessions per day, which mm-hmm. at the higher ends of both CrossFit and combat sports is relatively common. For those, because they're using so much glycogen and they're oxidizing so much carbohydrate, and they have this short window between sessions to try and restore that, we have to put more of an emphasis on getting glycogen stores back up for sessions that we want it to. Mm-hmm. So in that case, how we look at macronutrient composition is typically we may have, again, lower carbohydrate days and higher carbohydrate days. But in general, most days that are going to have a high performance goal are probably going to be relatively higher in carbohydrate, or the window before that is going to be. So again, going back to if it's a morning session, that's really high priority. The previous evening probably would have had a decent amount of carbohydrates in that. With that, there's different ways you can go. So you can have a relatively stable calorie intake if you want, and just as you increase carbohydrate, decrease fat, and then vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can have like the other option you suggested is keeping fat levels stable across the week and just cycling calories in line with cycling calories and carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
So as carbs go up, you're going to be pushing up calories as well. So both of those are viable strategies. Again, it just comes down to your rationale for doing which one. And as long as the overall intake across, let's say, that week is adequate for that person, you could probably do either one in those cases. But what you're probably doing in the case of those elite level athletes compared to the general population person we talked about is trying to see, okay, how much carbohydrate can we actually get in on certain days? So we have a cap on protein of this is a good amount of protein to get in, but any more is probably doing that much extra. We probably want to cover our fat intake to be above a certain threshold, but not super high. So we're leaving enough room for carbohydrate. And so if we're talking about ballpark figures, let's say protein might be somewhere between 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilo.
Mm-hmm.
And fat intake for, again, if we're talking about competitive athletes, I generally have this range of 0.5 up to 1 gram per kilo of body weight for most training days.
Mm-hmm.
And so probably starting athletes at that 1 gram per kilo figure. And then as they diet and have to reduce calories in their diet over the course of, say, a fight camp, we'd probably start having to reduce fat intake to take away some of the calories.
Mm.
Then when we have, say, a recovery or rest day where fat intake goes up and carbohydrate comes down, now we can have numbers outside of that range. We can push their fat intake up to 1.5 or even 2 grams per kilo. And then carbs will just scale conversely with that. So hopefully that got somewhere to answering your question, but that's the way how I think about different kind of macronutrients across the week.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's a great balance between, as you said, whether you're doing that many sessions to even warrant worrying about it. And as you said, for most general population people, it's just a case of don't worry yourself about it. Keep it as simple as you can. Because a lot of the time adherence is their biggest thing with the stresses of everything else they need to worry about in life.
Right, yeah.
Whereas
it's just never going to limit their performance, right? They're never going to be completely glycogen depleted and need to have a huge big carb load a couple of hours before a session if they're training 3 days a week or whatever. There's just so much time that it's not going to be a limiting factor for them.
No.
So as long as they're including some degree of healthy carbohydrates in their diet, the exact amount won't worry. So instead just think of in general a food pattern as opposed to actually macronutrients per se.
Yeah, and I find so many people just major in the minor because they'll be worried about their meal timing and their macros and the supplements, and you're just literally just try to keep it as simple as you can because you've got enough on your plate. Whereas people more toward the professional end or the performance spectrum, as you said, training 5 times a week, usually twice a day, it becomes much more of an issue of glycogen replen and meal timing.
Right.
And I'm glad you used those sort of ballpark figures of macros because they were completely in line with ones I've used in previous episodes. So
nice.
At least we're consistent with the messaging, which is what's
good.
important in my eyes. But no, that was fantastic. So we've talked a lot about, we'll talk about supplements next, but just before we do, we've talked a lot about calories, macros, that kind of thing. And for people who are on the performance side of things, they're probably in a way where they're going to need to track just because you need to make sure that you're getting in a certain amount of energy. But let's say you had someone who was I can't track. And for me, I've had this client, a person who is training for the CrossFit Games of all people, was look, I own 2 businesses. I've just had a baby. I'm training once or twice a day when I can fit it in. My life is hectic. I don't want to try to learn how to track and have that stress. How would you personally manage that client in terms of getting them the energy they need? What kind of habits would you use or help them instill?
Sure. So I think the first point that's probably useful that most athletes would find useful and may sometimes even expect, is having some sort of template that they can kind of visually get to grips of, okay, what does my day of eating might look like?
Mm-hmm.
So for those people, I can kind of do a lot of the work in the background of setting up a kind of template over a day that I know is probably going to put them in the right ballpark for overall energy and also the macronutrients, and then try and lay that out visually. So that might mean I give them, here's the kind of meal frequency we're going to go with,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's no one meal frequency that's actually required. We have huge kind of variation, but to keep it simple for them to follow, let's say we're going to go with, okay, 5 meals across the day. Your 3 main meals, 2 snacks. This is how it's going to look. Here's probably how we're going to time it based on your typical structure. Here's what each of those meals should likely look like. And then I can give them like, okay, we're going to have a portion of protein in each of those meals across the day, and visually show them, here's different protein sources in a serving size that will give you whatever I deem useful. So let's say 35 grams of protein.
Yep.
They don't even need to know that. They just need to see that visually. And the same, you can have templates built across the day, and then you can show, okay, when we're making certain food substitutions, what that might look like. So this would be having the flexibility to have rice instead of the potato there, using sweet potato, using pasta, whatever it is, interchangeably in those meals. Different protein sources can move in and out, and so on. So their structure's looking about the same. And then from there, in order to kind of try and capture how much they're actually eating on a day-to-day basis so that we can make good decisions, one of the simplest methods is just to use photos, right? So can you just take a photo of each meal before you're going to consume it? If there's a lot left, maybe take a photo at the end, but photo of each meal across the day. And after a number of days, I can get an idea of the portions they're using. And then we'll, again, going back to what I said right at the start, use that in comparison to their performance, their subjective recovery, and their body weight over time. So again, we're trying to notice, we don't want them under fueling. So again, in this case, which can happen quite a lot actually, particularly for like a CrossFit Games competitor, I'm sure you've seen how easy it is for them to under fuel. So trying to, again, make sure that they're feeling good, recovery's on top, and we're not seeing this kind of plummeting or trend down in body weight. And then over time, how much food can we actually get in that keeps them either weight stable, which a lot of time would be the goal, or if they do need to change body fat levels, then again, up or down. But presuming we're just going for weight stable, performance only, a kind of nice goal is, well, how much food can we actually get in and be that weight stable?
Yeah.
Because one of the problems with low energy availability, and we can maybe talk about that concept if you want, but you can have an athlete with low energy availability that isn't actually in a deficit.
Yes.
So they're still under eating for the amount of activity they're doing. And so then they get on these knock-on problems on, like they're physiologically and metabolically. Women may lose their period, for example. So you get your body basically shutting down reproductive function to save energy. So you have these problems where they're not fueling enough for the type of exercise they're doing, but their energy expenditure gets turned down so much that they're actually at weight maintenance.
Yes.
So that can be difficult to see. So the way around that is, okay, how much can we kind of increase the athlete's intake by, that we know they're at the kind of limit of, this is what they maintain weight on. If it's any more, they're going to be gaining weight. And that's kind of a good place to be. So we can, some of the strategies, like I said, that I would use in that case is having templates, using photos for the athlete, maybe even if they like a quick handwritten food diary, things that we just trying to keep an eye on. Generally, how much are they eating, and then make changes based on changes in body weight, and then subjectively how they're recovering. And so then we can say, okay, we want to add more into this meal, or we're going to add in an extra snack each day. And now they don't even need to know anything about calories. I just know if they do that on top of what they're doing, we're going to push up their calories and their macronutrients by this certain amount by adding in this extra snack, or by adding an extra portion of whatever to these 2 meals across the day.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's great. As you said there, I'm glad you mentioned the energy availability, because it can be very, very common for people to undereat and not actually realize they are doing so, but then their weight to remain stable. So it's like, but it's because they're not actually maximizing their energy expenditure. And quite often I have to remind, again, if we talk about general population briefly, it's like, that's probably unlikely happening for you guys. It's probably more of a consistency. It's probably more lifestyle things going on. We're talking more high-end athletes who are doing, hours of exercise each day.
Yes.
With those people, because I've definitely seen it myself, and I've tried different ways to do it. As you said, particularly with women, there can be the whole issue with the period. But even with men, and especially in CrossFit, there's a bit of an ego involved in CrossFit in terms of how shredded they need to look, just because of how jacked some guys get.
Right.
And we know the body fat percentage doesn't always, if never, correlates to performance, but to a certain degree, of course. But with athletes who say, I don't want to eat more because I'm not hungry and I don't want to gain body fat, how do you approach that?
Right. It can be a difficult one. And oftentimes, particularly with athletes, I find trying to make that conversation or make my case on health-based grounds all relatively often falls on deaf ears, unfortunately. So trying to tap it back into kind of performance as well. And one of the things we do see with relative energy deficiency is that there's not only these major health detriments, particularly if the problem is chronic, but also downsides for performance and recovery. And so if we can really kind of tap into, well, what is the goal of your training and nutrition? Like what are we trying to do here? And if it's trying to be the best CrossFitter you can possibly be, then I think what you're doing is probably not allowing you to do that, or is at least undercutting it in some way. So if that person says, actually, no, I want to be this level of body fat and be shredded, and that's more important to me, and I don't really care about being the best CrossFitter I can be, I just want to be relatively good but shredded. It's like, okay, we can try and work with that goal, but that's a kind of trade-off you have to be willing to make. And maybe some people would want to do that, right? And but for those that are doing the highest workloads that are most at risk of energy availability are typically the ones that do care most about their performance, right? They're trying to do, like, competition and doing well in events is what they're about. And so trying to show quite clearly, like we have undisputed research at this point of low energy availability and impacts on performance, the recovery, then you have these indirect effects of, well, if you have this and it's putting you at more risk of illness or injury, anytime you miss a training session because of illness or injury is one less opportunity that you could have been to get better, or it's putting you a step back. So I try and pull it back as much as possible to showing them this could directly impact where you're going to be in your performance. Maybe not like next week, but in the next 6 months, or particularly over the long term. And so trying my best to have that conversation and just basically make the points you said of like, there's a certain range of body fat you can probably get into that's going to make you more competitive. If you're carrying too much, you probably won't be able to do as well. If your body weight is too high, and it can, particularly for some like the gymnastics components, can be problematic. But once you're in a certain range, there's no one ideal body fat percentage that goes across the board. And that's maybe where people fall down. There's like, well, I see this guy winning events and he's more shredded, or he's like this percent body fat, but he may just naturally walk around at a bit lower body fat percentage than someone else. So it's not that it's necessarily better. It has to be a range that your body kind of settles at and isn't an active fight to keep down your body fat percentage that low. Like if you have to constantly restrict just to stay at that, and that's taking more of your focus, then that's just taking away from the resources you can put towards recovery and fueling intake. And then there's this other side of it that I mentioned is oftentimes just because we get you eating more food, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to gain more body fat. So again, if we can get you eating more food and your energy intake goes up, but now you're getting better quality training sessions, your NEAT levels go up, your physical activity thermogenesis goes up, you're going to be expending more energy as well. So the goal isn't to get you to eat more just to gain more body fat per se. It's how much can we get you eating, and also that's going to lead to better performances and more energy expenditure. So a combination of those things, but it can be difficult to kind of pull people apart from, like you said, the kind of ego component and body composition component, for sure.
Yeah, massively. But I think what you mentioned there about genetics as well, like some people will just naturally be able to sit at different places, and also prehistory of dieting, like what have they done before they've got there? Because if they're unfortunately a bit fluffy because they were a fat kid, it's like, well, you've got that now. And if it, as you said, if you're constantly trying to restrict just to get down to a low body fat percentage, you're now restricting your performance capabilities. So which one is that more important goal for you?
Right.
So it's aligning their priorities, isn't it, as you said?
Yeah, and that's it. And so that when we give like body fat recommendations, one of the things we talk to with our combat sport athletes is, well, when we're deciding on how much you should cut, what weight class you should be in, one question is, well, what body fat percentage should I sit at most of the year? And then what should I diet down to? And the answer to both those questions is kind of dependent on a lot of factors, but one of those is that genetic component that you can see some people are just generally able to function really well at leaner levels of body fat. And it doesn't mean the leanness is giving them the performance benefits, just that's genetically where they're
that's why they sit.
With other people, it's a bit higher. And so we try and give people exact examples of this. And you could probably do the same within, if you look at all the top CrossFit competitors, different body shapes, different sizes, they're probably their level of leanness going into the games. As you can see very big difference. They're all lean and all jacked, but the differences can be quite noticeable. And so if we show someone, well, look at how Conor McGregor and let's say Khabib Nurmagomedov, or even more of a contrast, Conor McGregor and someone like a Ben Askren. So the two UFC fighters, they function very well at very different body fat percentages, and their bodies look very different going in. Now, it isn't because Conor McGregor spends more time dieting down and getting shredded. Year round, he is super lean individual. He's just like really naturally, and so when he diets a bit, he looks like this. And so you could give the same if it's a CrossFitter. You can maybe give different examples of, well, look at these different athletes and look at how they perform. If this guy who looks like he's carrying maybe a small bit more body fat, but if he tried to diet down to look the exact same as this guy, his performance would probably suck.
Yes.
And then those kind of illustrations can help, I think.
Oh, yeah. And to be honest, everyone listening to this podcast who's done CrossFit or does CrossFit will know that Matt Fraser, who's won the games the last 3 times.
He's an example, Adam. Yeah.
Yeah, like, you know, he was on the men's fitness cover and he's got a little bit of love handle there, like a little bit of, like, don't get me wrong, he's still got visible abs and he's obviously an absolute machine. But he's there winning the sprint events, winning the endurance events, performing like an animal. And I love his Instagram because his Instagram combines great quality food with hyperpalatable junk food. And he's like, well, I need the calories to perform. And he was like, abs are great, but cheesecake tastes better was like one of the things he put again. And you've got to take it with a pinch of salt because, again, a 50-year-old mum doing CrossFit 3 times a week, she's not going to be able to get away with it like he is. But at least it then provides that sort of tongue-in-cheek of like, you know, if you're getting enough quality foods, having some hyperpalatable junk food in order to have higher calorie intake, higher carb intake, it's probably going to be beneficial for you. So let's remove that stigma of needing clean cut abs and also having to eat clean all the time, which is sort of one of my pet hates within this industry.
Yeah. And it's not the body fat percentage alone that you can view in isolation. It's the process it would take to get there. So
of course.
The Matt Fraser example is not saying, well, imagine if Matt Fraser was to diet and get even leaner and maybe he didn't have those kind of slight love handles you mentioned, or he gets even more shredded. It's like, yeah, but think of what he'd have to do to get there. He'd have to undereat for a certain period of time. That's going to increase his injury and illness risk. It's going to decrease his performance. It's going to decrease his recovery and how much workload he can handle. So is it actually going to make him a better athlete? Probably not. You could probably not really dispute much that he's doing pretty well when it comes to this CrossFit stuff. Yeah, he's doing okay.
Doing okay.
So yeah, those are really useful examples
for sure.
to have.
You can actually see it in other, like, because I followed the games reasonably closely up until the last couple of years. There was a female athlete who did a popular sort of macro counting program within the CrossFit space at the time, and she got super lean, but she was doing it right before the games. And then during the games, she just tanked. And it was, you know, I was there being like, it's because she was in a deficit, whereas everyone else was like, what's going on? But anyway, that's what I saw it as. Regarding the, relative energy deficiency, I made a small quip of like, we probably won't see it in Gen Pop. But, you know, I've had conversations with people, I'm sure you have as well, where people say, I'm definitely, you know, only eating this many calories, but my body weight's not shifting. I've still got body fat. But I do feel tired, low energy, no mojo, that kind of thing. And they swear that they're adhering to this 100%. Because, you know, the little demon in the back of my mind is adherence, you know, like everyone lies a little bit. But if they're giving these sort of same symptoms, do you then think, well, okay, actually, based off their food diary, where their metabolism should sit from a BMR point of view, and now I know that they're training on top, is it something you see with regular people? Is there a case for maybe a reverse diet, that kind of thing, eating more in order to lose more?
So like you say, I would lead off by saying, first we need to like tick off the things that are probably most obvious most of the time in like general population of reasons for weight stalls or inability to decrease body fat. One is that kind of misreporting, either unintentionally, so like either not tracking things accurately, having portion sizes that are beyond maybe what was in a kind of template, maybe forgetting about certain meals or snacks or coffees that they had that all kind of add up across the day. So it could be that they're just consuming more than they actually think they are. The second is the consistency. So they could be doing that 5 or 6 days of the week. And then one day, if it's a complete blowout, might be enough to level out their calories for the whole week. And so if they're doing that over time, yeah, they could be maintaining weight and still feel like they're dieting all the time, because they're dieting 5 or 6 days a week for 2 months. But if they're having this kind of perfection and then binge, then that's probably going to cause some of those issues. If that's not the case and people are like eating what looks like a relatively low amount, don't seem to be decreasing body fat, even though they'd expect to at that level of calories, depending on the circumstance, there is a few things that could explain it. One thing to note is that, again, going back to the genetic component, we know that when people diet and reduce their calorie intake, you also get this co-contaminant decrease in energy expenditure. So you can't change your calories in without having an impact on calories out. Whether that's up or down, your body has this homeostatic response that will decrease or increase your calorie expenditure. So as you drop your calories in, your body decreases your energy expenditure to try and account for that. Mainly that's a decrease in this non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so energy being expended from moving just subconsciously throughout the day, not any planned exercise. But what we see is there's a huge genetic variation in how much that decreases in response to a decrease in calories. Some people, when they drop their calories, could have a very small decrease in energy expenditure, so now their deficit is still quite large. Others can have a huge decrease in energy expenditure, so now that deficit is actually relatively small. So now we could take two individuals, let's say they have like same size, gender, training program, age, they maintain their weight even the same number of calories. Now we decrease their calories by the same amount. The actual net deficit they're in could be different. So we decrease both their calories by 500, but if one of them has a much larger drop in energy expenditure compared to the other person, now actually how much that deficit is could be different. So if people are trying to compare, well, I was expecting to lose this much per week, and after 3 weeks I haven't, I was like, they might be one of those people that have this huge drop in energy expenditure. And so to get to a certain goal, they might need to create what looks like on paper a larger deficit than they would have thought. And they need to have a bigger decrease in calories to get there. That could be one component. There could be some other kind of adaptations if it's been long-term chronic low energy availability, particularly again if this is married up with symptoms like amenorrhea or loss of menstrual function. Then there could be something going on where this like just massive adaptation downwards of their metabolism that could be at play. And so again, one way is to kind of, okay, we'll spend a bit of time not trying to diet. Let's bring calories back up. Let's try and get them up to a point where we're getting plenty of food in whilst maintaining weight, or even if there's a slight increase, okay, and then kind of work from there. That could be a case. I suspect that, again, that's much more likely in really highly active, probably relatively lean athletes. For the average person, I think it would probably be some of the other factors or answers to that question more so. But there are a few things that could be going on.
Yeah, for sure. I think as well, if they need to, as you said, it depends what symptoms they align with. And then if they think that there's something definitely off key, it's going to a doctor and getting some blood tests, maybe even
further
tests, metabolism-wise and thyroid, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So there could be clinical issues here that we haven't talked about as well. It could be they might get diagnosed with like hypothyroidism, which is going to bring down their energy expenditure. It could be that they've been recently prescribed certain medications or drugs that then can cause this kind of weight gain or prevention of weight loss. It could be chronic stress and low sleep, and now they're retaining more water. And so even their body fat loss is now being masked by this increase in water weight. So there's lots of things that may prevent us seeing them making progress for those other reasons that go beyond just simply their energy intake.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. And there's, again, they'll need to check that with their own sort of GP, health practitioner, whatever country they're in. Briefly, because obviously I'm conscious of your time, we talked a little bit about lifestyle factors incorporated within performance, even within weight loss. What would be the main ones that you would look to control? And then how would that, I guess, how would that have a knock-on effect to their diet at that time?
Sure. So obviously, if we take aside diet and exercise, we can talk about generally being physically active. So outside of training, just like being active more so than completely sedentary would be good. The big ones outside of those things, I typically are ones people would have heard of already. Sleep, absolutely huge. We could spend a whole day talking about this really, but trying to have a sufficient amount of time of in-bed time where you're actually giving yourself an opportunity to get maximal sleep. Trying to have relatively consistent sleep and wake times, looking at your sleep environment. So like, is it the room dark? Is it cool? Do you have maybe some sort of wind down period? Are you preventing blue light being in the room late at night? So like from iPads or LEDs and alarm clocks, things like that. So trying to maximize sleep quality and quantity is a huge one. That's going to be big for really any type of athlete or for even just general health. Tied to that, my kind of big thing at the moment is kind of circadian rhythms, circadian biology, and how not only just looking at sleep and wake cycles, but looking at light and dark cycles as well. So people are getting pretty good at realizing the importance of like preventing some of that bright blue light exposure late at night. Because blue light that we get from like devices or from indoor lighting or from LEDs can suppress melatonin, which is important for that to rise before bed. And so most people are kind of clued into that now. I think they would have seen like a blue light filter on their phone or use some sort of software like Flux to put an amber light on their laptop screen, or try not to have like lots of bright lights in bed. But the kind of converse of that is we probably should be trying to get plenty of blue light exposure early in the day. And the best way to do this is just get outside in daylight. So the intensity of light in daylight is multiple fold higher than anything you can get indoors. So trying to even get some exposure to daylight during the day can have a profound impact on not only those circadian rhythms, but then is one of the big things anecdotally I've seen for people with sleep. If they're finding it difficult to get to sleep, if they get more outdoor daylight exposure early in the day, that seems to help a lot with onset of sleep. So those things, sleep, circadian rhythms, which I'll stop there because I can talk ad nauseum about if you want to get into it. And then stress mitigation or reduction is probably one of the most difficult, and is again where I'm not really an expert, but there are people talk about different strategies to bring down stress, whether that's through meditation, and mindfulness. Those things have like huge amount of research behind them now. It could be certain breath work. It could be certain routines to de-stress. It could be journaling. It could be therapy. It could be talking with friends. Those things can all be used to some degree of stress mitigation, mindfulness, etc. And then the other one is probably social interaction. When we see like long-term health impacts and risk of like mortality, chronic diseases, etc. Two of the big risk factors tend to be social isolation and loneliness, which are sometimes used synonymously, but are kind of slightly different. So social isolation being essentially isolated from other people and other relationships and interactions, whereas loneliness is more of a kind of subjective assessment of where you are in regards to those kind of relationships. So you can essentially be surrounded by lots of people, but still feel lonely. whereas you can actually not feel lonely but still be socially isolated. So slightly different constructs.
Yeah.
But so the kind of take home there is like, how do we focus on the relationships around us, friends, family, people we're going to interact with most? How do we try and keep hold of good relationships? How do we try and make sure we're included socially in events? Pay attention to those things. Don't let those slip at the expense of just focusing on business or just focusing on training, because those have a massive knock-on impact on health. And I think that a healthier, in the most well-rounded word of like a healthy human that someone is, the more likely they are to be a good athlete for a longer period of time.
For sure.
So those would be views on sleep, circadian biology, social interaction, and then like stress mitigation. So big issues, but they're the ones I'd probably touch on.
Yeah, perfect. And it's a good way to kind of wrap up the show, I think, in terms of, we know that nutrition is important and it's something that a lot of people overlook, but a lot of the time I think a lot of people put the cart before the horse, and they try to take a greens powder before they focus on getting 8 hours of sleep. So It's definitely like, let's focus on the big blocks first. So a lot of lifestyle symptoms I think a lot of people overlook, and definitely we could get back on and talk about that circadian biology, that circadian rhythm shift work, because it massively interests me as well, and I think a lot of people would benefit from hearing more about that as well. But
awesome.
Probably it's for another day.
Yes, I think
we've cracked on enough now. So you mentioned a bit about obviously who you were, where you were from at the start, but just so if you wanted to direct anyone anywhere, where's the best place to go?
Cool. So probably the best place is just sigmanutrition.com. Mm-hmm. Everything is up there. If people want to check out the podcast, then it's just Sigma Nutrition Radio on any podcast app that they use. And then I'm pretty easy to find, I think, on social media. So if they're like on Instagram, it's just Danny Lennon _Sigma, or just type my name into Twitter or Facebook and I should be able to easily be found. But the Sigma Nutrition probably has everything listed for you there.
It does, yeah. And I'll put a few links in the show notes as well. Particularly, we mentioned the podcast with James Morton, as well as I know you did one with John Hawley around circadian biology quite recently. So those both could be quite useful for folks. So yeah, thanks again for being on. And
Johnny, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No worries, mate. Have a great rest of your day.
Yes, thank you.